In a previous video on this channel, I discussed the never was drivers. Drivers that are meant to race in IndyCar but never did. There's plenty of other stories like the ones discussed in that video, so by extremely popular demand, I'm back with another installment of Never Was Drivers. One story that I neglected to mention in the first installment was the one of Dale Earnhardt racing in the Indy 500. It's a pretty far out there rumor, and we'll have seen Dale Earnhardt race for Team Menard in the Indy 500. Besides speculation of a mysterious driver testing an IndyCar with his helmet on the whole time, obscuring his identity much like the Stig on Top Gear, there's little to go off of with this. All we know is that the offer was there in the 90s. Would we have seen the 7-time Cup Series champion win the greatest spectacle in racing? Probably not, considering the unreliability of the Buick engines that Menard ran, but who knows? This story has always been interesting to me, despite it being nothing but a rumor. Switching over now to one of Dale Earnhardt's closest friends, we have Neil Bonnett. Unlike Dale, Neil actually attempted 2 Indy 500s, first in 1979 and second in 1981, though both were ultimately unsuccessful. In a highly controversial month of May in 1979, Bonnett had a quiet month that ended with an engine failure just before time trials, forcing him to withdraw. His next attempt at the race ended in similar fashion, with Bonnett being withdrawn. In a notable era that saw fellow Alabama gang members Bobby and Donnie Allison race in the Indy 500, Neil was unsuccessful in his 2 attempts and stuck with NASCAR for the rest of his life. I doubt Bonnett would have been great in the series, and to be brutally honest, his time in the series would have most likely just been simple trivia, but it's still an interesting note in the Indy history books. You know what's pretty much the complete opposite of NASCAR in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s? That's right, pre-World War II Grand Prix racing. Considered by some as one of the greatest Grand Prix drivers of all time, Tazio Nuvolari was a one-of-a-kind talent. Starting off as a motorcycle racer before switching to cars, Nuvolari's prowess behind the wheel of a race car turned him into a racing god in Italy. But although he had found success in Europe, his brief time in America was anything but. Nuvolari only entered 1 Indy 500, that being the 1938 running. Nuvolari's entry is pretty forgotten in the current day, as little to no information about the entry has ever been documented publicly. I wasn't really satisfied with this conclusion, so I tried to reach out to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum to try and find any more information about this entry. However, as of me recording this on Thursday the 18th of May, they haven't replied to me. If I do find more information about this entry, expect a video about it later this year. Going from nearly 100 years ago to something from last year, we now take a look at Felipe Drugovich, who after winning the Formula 2 championship in 2022, was allegedly given a 3-year contract to drive for Chip Ganassi Racing starting in 2023. Drugovich instead opted for a reserve driver deal with Aston Martin in Formula 1. Drugovich could still obviously race in the series. He's only 22 after all, and being solely a reserve driver could get a bit boring. That's just conjecture, but we do know that he was at least given one offer, and considering this guy's track record and very obvious talent, it certainly won't be the last. From one Brazilian to another, let's talk about Ayrton Senna, a driver many of you suggested in the first installment. Ayrton actually tested for Team Penske at Phoenix Raceway in December of 1992. The 3-time world champion was stuck without a contract to race in F1 at this point, as his goal of joining reigning champion Williams was blocked, and his McLaren contract ran out at the end of 1992. Had the Senna Penske IndyCar move gone through, he would have joined fellow former world champion and Brazilian Emerson Fittipaldi and rookie Paul Tracy. Tracy's entry into Penske would have definitely been up in the air if this came to be, but it didn't, as Senna would re-sign for McLaren for 1993, driving alongside Michael Andretti. Senna would then drive for Williams in 1994, where he would be killed at the San Marino Grand Prix. Had Ayrton joined IndyCar from 1993 on, there's no doubt he would have been just as special as he was in Formula 1. It's hard to say what exactly he would have done, but he would have definitely been a race winner, and maybe a champion as well. In my opinion, it's one of the biggest what-ifs in IndyCar history. Next up, I'd like to talk about David Pook, who was entered but later withdrawn from the first ever IndyCar race at the now defunct Kentucky Speedway in 2000. Pook's entry is a bit of an anomaly, as nothing about this entry can really be found on the internet. He had previous experience in Indy Lights, and was the son of Long Beach Grand Prix co-founder and former kart president Chris Pook. David never returned to IndyCar in any meaningful capacity, and his name is fairly obscure in motorsports circles. As for what could have been, there's really nothing to draw off of, as we don't even know what team he would have driven for. It's not the biggest what if in the world. If anything, it's one of the most inconsequential what ifs I'll ever discuss, but while it may not be important, it still deserves a mention. Next up is former Malcolm in the Middle star Frankie Muniz. Outside of his career as an actor, Frankie has always been a racer at heart, and is currently having a very solid full-season campaign in ARCA. But before his most recent stock car adventures, Frankie was on track to becoming an IndyCar driver. In the mid to late 2000s, Frankie was racing in Formula BMW and later Champ Car Atlantics, where he impressed. He was considering a move to IndyCar whilst in the midst of a very impressive 2009 season in Atlantics. However, this move never came to be, as a back and wrist injury effectively ended his driving career for the time being. It would have been a pretty cool story had it happened, but it would have certainly been a rushed move. Frankie had yet to win in the Atlantic Series, so while it's a really interesting what if, it wasn't very likely to happen either. It was still on the cards, however, and that's why I've included it. One of Mexico's brightest racing talents of all time is Pedro Rodriguez, but despite being a pretty good driver in Formula 1, he never found success in USAC Champ cars. He tried to race the Indy 500 on 3 separate occasions, these attempts coming in 1963, 64, and 67. Pedro's sights were set on Formula 1, so chances are if he ever raced in the series, it would have come many years farther down the line, probably the early to mid 80s. Maybe he would have had a similar career path to Emerson Fittipaldi, but it's hard to say. Pedro certainly had the talent to do well in the series, but there's really not a lot to draw off of. For our 5th Formula 1 driver in this video, I'd like to talk about the first ever Formula 1 World Drivers Champion, Giuseppe Farina. Farina, much like Nuvolari before him, is an icon of Italian motorsports, and one of the best early Grand Prix drivers. In the inaugural F1 season in 1950, Farina won twice and had 2 more top 10s, but the 2 races he didn't have good results in that year were Monaco, where he retired, and the Indy 500, in which he didn't take part. For those who may not know, yes, the Indianapolis 500 was a part of the Formula 1 schedule during the 1950s, albeit it was ran under a completely different rule set with little to no crossover of anything. Farina wouldn't attempt the race until 1956, by which point he was essentially out of racing. Driving in a Ferrari Straight 6 powered Curtis Craft, the Grand Prix legend wouldn't make the Indy 500. He'd try again the next year, but had difficulty getting used to the Indy-style cars. He'd eventually ask Keith Andrews to test the car, but sadly Andrews would be killed trying to test the car. Farina would withdraw from the 1957 Indy 500, and essentially retired from racing in the aftermath. And finally, I'd like to talk about Harry Sauce, a former lawyer and racing driver. He mainly drove in the SCCA, but also attempted the Indy 500 twice, where in 1983 his entry was denied, and in 1988 he spun during his rookie test and was later withdrawn from the event. The man with one of the most oddly funny names in motorsports history didn't find much success as a driver, but the man has still lived his life in the fast lane, and I'm sure he's got a lot of great stories to share. Thanks to the support on the first volume of the show, and all the drivers y'all mentioned in the comments, a part 3 is already in the works as of this video's release. Thank you all so much for the support on that video. It's pretty absurd how many views that video got. If you've got any more ideas of drivers you'd like me to cover, leave a comment telling me about them. Thank you for watching, and have a great afternoon.